Welcome back to The Urban Monk. Dr. Pedram Shojai here with David Gershon. This gentleman, he's a futurist and a visionary, the CEO of the Empowerment Institute, and he does a lot of work with the United Nations. He's getting called in. He's one of the foremost authorities on behavior change and community empowerment on the planet. And he's a large system thinker, he's a big thinker, and he's a delightful human being. I really, like, he and I have developed a very nice relationship, friendship, and I'm tapping him as a valuable resource for our next movie, and you'll know why after you listen to this interview. He's just on level in many ways. He's written 11 books with bestseller, The Low Carbon Diet, which is a 30-day program to lose 5,000 pounds. For all you weight loss junkies, how's that for a gauntlet? And so he's doing it, and he has proof for a lot of the things that they've done. And so they're doing data-driven decisions and having actionable plans to actually save the planet. I love this guy. Enjoy the show. I'll see you on the other end. Talk is cheap, and you're on the ground doing stuff.
Thank you, Pedram, very much. So, a word about the UN and a word about governments and a word about social change. Even if you had the UN working at its best, even if governments were able to work at their best, and there are many governments that do work at their best, particularly some of the Scandinavian countries, there is a limitation on what policy can achieve when so much of the change that's required is transformative and policy is primarily reformative. It is going to fall short. And one of the things that I have been looking at is the question of how do we really think deeper about the how of social change itself. I call that reinventing social change. And I wrote this book, Social Change 2.0, that looks at that. And as we think about the world right now and where we are, what we are seeing is, from a systems point of view, that most of the issues we face are social system breakdowns, our economic system, our political system, which you alluded to, our healthcare system, which is your world, and education. It goes on. And so the problem we face as a species is that the magnitude of problems we have to address, the issues we have to address, are much greater than the way that the tools have been designed, which are primarily legislative, to create the change. So when a system is unable to perform against the expectations placed on it, it starts to perturbate, or it starts to oscillate, it becomes unstable. And that's the state of our world right now. And then it either breaks down or it goes into low-grade functionality. And that's where we are. And in order to change that, we have to do what in systems theory is called second-order change, or move the system to a higher level of performance and social value through a transformational intervention. And that's the work that I do. The book I wrote is designed to do second-order change. And the issue of climate change, which you teed up earlier, and the work that I'm doing there, among other things, is a second-order change solution. Let me just add one more thought. And then, please, the point, though, is not to discount what I call social change 1.0, but to enhance it and empower it through its integration.
Well, you're very inclusive in that, and I think I want to speak to the frustrations of the world right now, because I mean, we all know that there's problems. We all know that things ain't working, and oil spills and water and toxic and everything's yucky, right? And we know that this can't be sustained, but it almost seems like everyone's relying on some bigger organizations, institutions, governments. Everyone's waiting for someone else to jump in and fix it. And the people that are in the positions to fix it oftentimes are just trying to get reelected, and they're not necessarily the types of people who care about this. And so as an individual, how can I feel empowered to jump back in and take ownership of my life, my community, and my globe in a way that is realistic? Because I think people think that they're too small for social change, and this is why I love this conversation, and you and I have had a lot of offline conversations, and that's why you're here, is because I'm just a big fan of this kind of thinking. So yeah, let's jump into how an individual can do it.
You have gotten to the essence of the challenge we have as a species right now, and I laid that out as the current solutions are not designed to address the issues. At the scale of magnitude, those issues need to be addressed to have a real impact. So we either go into cynicism, or we go into passivity, or we go into what I call the good fight. We know we're not going to make an impact, but we'd rather do something than nothing. Mm. And none of those are really very effective in actually getting the result we want. And that's where there's this climate paralysis, for example, because that one we actually have to get right. We can live in low-grade conflicts. We can live in social inequities because the planet won't go away, or the ability for the planet to sustain human life won't go away. But climate change, we've got to get right, or we start to have a deteriorated experience as human beings. So the question that I've been pondering for many decades now is, how do you empower individuals to become effective agents of change? And what I have found through lots of trial and error is that the place where we human beings have the most chance to have impact is in their own communities. Because if you can do something at a community level, you can build a model that can be scaled across many communities. National governments, international agencies look to communities as the place where new ideas and innovation, social innovations, are born. So communities are really the incubator, the place where possibilities are being developed. And so that's where I've honed in, because we can really have an impact. And politics does not get in the way particularly. Politics doesn't really show up at the level of potholes or crime issues or health issues at that level. So then the question is, if we were working at the scale of a community, where do you actually get leverage? How do you engage people? And there really are two questions that at the end of the day, one has to ask if one's going to ask, has one had an impact? What are the pro-social behaviors that need to be adopted? And how do you scale them? Because unless you get actual behavior change, everything else is a means to an end. Legislation, financial incentives, social protest. And at some point, we can talk about the current state of social change tools, but we'll get to that maybe later. But the main point is it's the individual behavior change at scale, community by community, that we have a chance to leverage a significant intervention. So that's where I've honed in. And as I did that, I began to discover that there was one place in a community where we had the most potential, and that was the scale literally of the block, both sides of the street up to the corners, because there's shared social value. There's a shared social purpose. There's enough connectivity, and there's enough desire for connectivity, and there's not connectivity. So when there's a social need that's not being met, it can be leveraged. And that's a whole download on our strategy to do that. But the program that we've designed to address climate change, we call the Cool Block. And that idea is to address the issue of carbon reduction at the household level, block by block, but also enhancing that by other key social drivers, such as disaster resiliency and livability and water conservation, so that when a person has a choice between actually connecting with their neighbors, having a sense of self-efficacy, and addressing these issues, some of which are survival, some of which are aspirational, and they can have it all done for them versus not doing it, and they want to connect if they could for the sense of community, they do. And we have found that. And so that's the program that we've built based on several decades of work that we're now getting ready to launch. And we think it could actually change the game. That's called overall project, the Cool City Challenge.
So yeah, I want to speak to that real quick, because this isn't conjecture. This isn't a guy theorizing about this. You've been on the ground level and you've been proving out these assumptions. So this isn't like, oh, hey, we should try this. But you have your data, you have your proof points, and now these are data-driven decisions actually showing, we nailed it here, we nailed it there, and now we're moving into growing this and scaling it and making it a model for hopefully humanity. And so this is several years in the making. This soup has been cooking for a while. So I'd love to speak to that just for a second, just so people get how much work has gone into getting to the place we're at, and this is a real thing.
I love that. So it's actually been 25 years in the making. One of the things I talk about in my book is that in order to be ready when the world is ready, you have to be way ahead of the curve. Because when the world's ready, it's not the time to experiment. So I've been in school for quite a while trying to answer a bunch of questions. And it began actually in 1989 when I learned about the fact that the world and the global ecosystem, well, particularly the global ecosystem, was deteriorating. When the word sustainable development was first being created, the very beginning of that journey. And I had done a major global event prior to that, and it was quite impactful, passing a torch of peace around the world and engaged 62 countries and 45 heads of state and 25 million people in partnership with the United Nations Children's Fund. And it showed me that one could think big. One could do things that no one thought was possible. And I asked the question, so what is the highest and best use of my life? Where is the most important leverage point for change on the planet, for humanity's evolution? And that's where I began. And I discovered that it wasn't just that the ecosystem was unraveling, but the reason, and the United Nations created a conference called the Earth Summit in 1992, and they stated it this way: the greatest cause of the deterioration of the global ecosystem is the unsustainable patterns of consumption and production in the developed world. So if we're going to change the world, we have to change the consumption and production of those of us in the developed world. So as I took that idea in, I said, well, so where's the leverage point for that? It became very clear the leverage point was consumption, because if you change consumption practices, you change production practices, because demand drives supply in business. So that was the beginning. And once I began to get there, then I asked, well, what is the state of people actually changing their behaviors? And we found that they were asking 4 questions. Where do I start? Which are the important actions? How do I do them? And if I did them, would they make a difference, to your larger point? And those became our drivers. I had been developing a whole program on empowerment, so I knew a lot about empowerment, how to get people to change behavior, how to build visions that people could then be motivated to live their lives by. And that began the journey. So let me pause there, because there's a lot. I can go into a long discourse on what we learned from there, but I want to just pause to just not go too far ahead of where your questions might take us.
Well, you know what, you're singing my song, and you've been doing this for so long and proving it out that it warms my heart, I gotta say, because this is the same problem we have in healthcare, is behavioral change, and there's literacy gaps, and there's motivation gaps, and all the kinds of things. It's like, everyone knows you should eat well, so what? And so what do I need to do, and how am I gonna see the difference? People do diets, they gain the weight back, so screw it, I might as well just drink beer and forget about it. And so we don't stand that opportunity when it comes to climate change, because we are headed towards a very real potential extinction event. We have, all the stuff that's happening right now in, say, Syria, right? This started as a climate change issue that people don't really know about. Now it's an immigration issue, and it's like a huge thing in the EU. But it all started with something that people are not interested in talking about, because I think the elephant in the room is industry. It's those containers of, shoes that how many pairs of shoes do you need? It's the containers of stuff that we're getting, manufactured in China, and we're spending our hard-earned dollars putting coal into the air to get yet another thing that the advertisers are telling us we need to wear to look cool. So that right there is That's the beast that you're trying to tackle, is this economy that's built on consumers constantly putting their money into Target and Walmart and wherever's moving the stuff. And that's a haymaker, man. Like that's some revolutionary stuff. And there's a lot of people that are not interested in having that conversation because that's how they butter their bread. So I'd love to kind of sit on that point for a second, because the core of this is really a very revolutionary, fundamental shift in how we live our lives. And once we understand that, I think it gets way easier.
Well, I'm happy that you're not asking small questions. What a waste of time that would be. So let's tackle this big question. There are different elephants in the room. That's certainly one of them. Another one is our materialistic worldview and lifestyle and how we perceive the world itself. So it's not just that business is the source of the problem, and we're at the effect of someone driving stuff that we don't want on us. It's that our values are such that we're not asking the right questions about what's important in our own lives, where meaning and purpose exists, what will give us value, how do we fulfill a need non-materially. So there are deeper questions. And then there is the question, how do we become a force to empower business to be more inspired, to think differently, to play differently, because we do need things. We may not need as many things. We may want more quality things because we're in bodies. So we're not here to avoid the material plane. So it's a dance. And the question that I always ask is, where is the leverage point? Because at the end of the day, that, as Archimedes has said, a lever, give me a lever long enough and you can move the world. And that's where I've always been focused. Where's the lever that can move the world? And what I've found is empowering an individual to dream a different dream than the one that we've been given will empower them to ask different questions that will empower them to make different choices. And I was just reading yesterday a report by Cohn, who does research on corporate social responsibility, and they said the consumers are changing their whole value system. It is happening. And businesses are beginning to respond, and the early adopters are asking different questions, and they're getting rewarded significantly because they're asking different questions. And the ones that are succeeding are asking the boldest questions. And my colleague that's helping with the Cool City Challenge and a variety of other initiatives, a woman named Josie Marin, and her work, who's helping support our work and who we're in deep partnership with, is asking those questions. And she's a consumer company, sells natural cosmetics. And so she's asking these hard questions. They're not easy answers, but there are important questions to be asked. And really also asking not just how do we reduce bad stuff coming at us or change our patterns of consumption based on our own values, but also how can business become a force for social good? How can business actually step up and be part of the playing field to change the game itself? Because business is playing way smaller considering its impact on the planet than it could be. So the other part of our work is also to help invite business to play a much bigger game. We call it corporate social engagement. So having them on the side of the planet's well-being and humanity's evolution is a huge opportunity. So there are a bunch of pieces here. There's not one easy answer to that big question.
Sure. And we're doing our next movie on the corporate side of this, on the for-benefit side of the economy and what conscious capitalism means. And we're in discussions about how to capture some of this work that you're doing on a block-by-block level to show this stuff in action. Because the good news is we have hundreds, if not thousands, of living examples of models that are working, companies that are doing the right thing, things that are happening right now that are changing the landscape of how we can fundamentally operate our economy differently. And because we're in the time where it's happening, it's hard to notice. I mean, this era will go down in history books one way or another as being a very, very kind of critical transitional era in our in our development as a society. And there's some really positive indicators. I mean, this is, I want to kind of get a little more granular and talk about what's happening on a block by block level. Like, what's the methodology where you guys are going in, getting people to actually get engaged, and then reducing carbon footprint? Because that, to me, is that's where the rubber hits the road, obviously.
I am delighted to have you ask me that question. I wanted to make sure we were ready for that question. And we aren't ready for that question, really, until we answer some of the bigger questions on how to hold the larger framework of the drivers of negative and positive impacts. So we're ready to drive the next level down, which is the granularity of how we actually change behavior and bring it to scale. So when we ask the 4 questions, where are we now? Basically boiling down to what are the important actions? How do I take the actions? If I took the actions, would it make a difference? Where do I start? We discovered that there were a lot of programs out there to provide awareness. 50 simple things to save the earth and 350. There was no lack of awareness raising checklists of things people could do, but they weren't doing them. And given my history of work around empowerment, the question that I began to ask was why? And they were asking these questions. They weren't getting good answers. The tools out there at the time were not delivering. They were basically awareness raising. So what would it take to change behavior? If we could change behavior, would it be sustained over time? And if we were able to change behavior that was sustained over time, could we bring it to scale so we could have a real impact? Those became the next set of questions. And those are questions that I'm continuously asking. And what I'll share with you is really something that's taken place over several decades of iterative learning. And one of my best assets is that I am a tenacious learner. So when I get questions, I stay with them until I get satisfying answers that can then be proven out with research and data, and then built upon, and then continue to iterate. So that's the learning process, which is as important as the methodology I'll share with you. Because what we need are people to know how to be good social learners, good social innovators, skillful social innovators, so that they can actually learn how to fish themselves. And that's a lot of my work as well. So what we found was that we were taking the overwhelm of information around those 4 questions, and it boiled down to, at the end of the day, your life is around how, your life in terms of its impact on the planet boils down to 5 metrics. How much solid waste you generate, how much energy you generate, how much water you use, how much transportation fuel you use, and how you consume products. So solid waste, energy, water, transportation, and purchasing of things. And so the question was, where do we need to go to get people to have a more sustainable use of natural resources? And what we found also, by the way, in America, we use a third of the planet's resource and we waste up to 75% through inefficiency and lack of awareness. So the low-hanging fruit was immense, is immense, because efficiency is certainly one of the easier places. That doesn't even have to deal yet with our sustainability practices and our desire for material things to meet non-material needs. So we created a program. We called it the Green Living Program. And it was based on those 5 topic areas along with empowerment. If I act but no one else does, we don't get very far. So how do I empower others to also be part of the solution? And then we broke it down in each topic area into a set of recipes as opposed to checklists. Since you deal with food a lot, you know that you can't cook a meal very well with a checklist. You need an actual recipe. So we step by step by step. Then you do this, then you do this, then you do this. And then we found that we had created the state-of-the-art program on how to live a sustainable lifestyle, 6 steps to live a sustainable lifestyle. And we realized that that was still not enough, because the way people actually change behavior once they have a tool like that is around the notion of social norms. And the key to a social norm, a new social norm, is a peer support group. So when you get together with others and they start to change their behavior, you start to create a new social norm. You know that about eating. So all behavior change programs of any consequence have learned that. So we created what we called eco teams, a peer support group that creates peer motivation, peer pressure, and peer knowledge for how to take these actions and accountability. And so we built the program over 8 meetings and every 2 weeks. And here's what we found out. Based on working with about 20,000 people, and this is a learning process that took place over a number of years, we were able to help them reduce their solid waste by 40%, their water use by 32%, their energy usage by 15%, their CO2 emissions by 18%, their vehicle miles traveled, the amount of driving they do, by 8%. They saved on average about $255. And so we found that we had answered the first question, can we have substantive behavior change? We found many cities then saying to us, will you help us? This is huge for us. We spend so much money on providing natural resources and people waste them, and it's big parts of our budget, not to mention all the pollution that's being generated and solid waste, landfill being filled up. So we started working with cities and they started seeing these results, and then they started saying, well, let's find out if it's sustained over time. And then we started finding also this was so effective that it started diffusing to many different countries around the world, in Europe and Asia. And so over time, we had 8 studies done to see if these behavior changes were sustained over time. And what we found was that they were consistently. And one of the most robust longitudinal studies done by a university in the Netherlands, University of Leiden, found that on average, people took 26 behaviors. They sustained them over time and added 3 new ones. 53% of the people transferred what they learned to the workplace. And this was pretty consistently happening. So we had answered the second question, can you sustain the behavior change over time? And then the third question, which is really the next one, and it's still the one I'm working on, because scale is a big question and there's different dimensions to scale, is can you take it to scale? And what we found was that, first of all, people who went through this program and followed the structure that we set up of how to organize these meetings and lead these self-directed meetings, 95% of those teams completed the program effectively. So if they followed the form, they would get these results pretty consistently. So the question then was, what's the best platform for scaling? And we did this with social networks, friends. We did it with workplaces. We did it with service clubs, faith-based groups. And we did it with neighborhoods, particularly the block. And it worked effectively at all the levels. But when we got to the block, we saw something that we didn't see anywhere else. For starters, you could scale a block. You didn't run out of a social network. You could keep scaling it once you found the formula. But the second thing that we found was that we were meeting a much more robust set of social needs, unmet social needs. So what we found basically, and by the way, one of the other things we did, Pedram, was we debriefed every one of these eco teams. So we had lots and lots of data of what worked and what didn't. So 10 ways to invite your neighbors, more like 10 ways not to invite your neighbors. And maybe there are 2 ways to invite your neighbors. And once we found that, we did a lot of research to really test a simple question. And this was the ultimate question that we formulated, and based on a lot of that research. If your neighbor said the following to you, how likely would you be to come to their home? Which, by the way, could also be their apartment if it's a urban high-rise. Hi, I'm your neighbor from up the street. You could literally point to your house. I'd like to invite you to a neighborhood gathering to hear about a program sponsored by the city of, whatever your city, so they see the credibility, to learn how to better conserve resources for the sake of our children, to get to know each other better as neighbors, and to create a healthier, safer, more livable block. The meeting is this Thursday night, 7:30 to 9. Can you make it? What we found was that on our research, 43% said very likely, 42% said somewhat likely. And I'm going to talk about a whole model of diffusion we call Everett Rogers' diffusion of social innovation in a moment. But that's 85% of the people who heard that message were predisposed, which is the late majority if you follow this whole model, which is huge. And when we found, so let me tell you what actually happened. So when people did this, about 75% said they would come, pretty close to the numbers. Well, somewhere between 75 and 85, it's really hard to know precisely those numbers, they varied. Half came and 75% joined. And we were getting 25% of every block, no matter where we did this, to do this, to participate, which is an amazing recruitment number.
Huge. Yep.
And it was happening in Kansas City, Missouri, and Portland, Oregon, and the inner city of Philadelphia. And
so we're not talking about kumbaya hippies. We're talking about a swath of general Americans from different psychographics, demographics. This isn't just like the choir.
This isn't the choir. I want to talk about the choir because the choir is actually important.
Sure.
But the point is that we were tapping a set of social needs that were much more profound than the demographics. And when we broke down those needs, it boiled down to 3 intrinsic motivations. This is really important for your work with health behavior change or any behavior change. I'm doing some work around health behavior change now also, as you know. So when you broke down a program to help us get to know each other better as neighbors, we were tapping into community. The need, intrinsic need in people to connect with others. When we said conserving resource for the sake of our children, we were tapping into the need for meaning and purpose, the most profound need human beings have. Because through doing this, they could actually feel like they were doing something for their children's future or for children's future. They may not be able to change the world, but they could at least have an impact on the lives of those individuals they most care about, or at least feel they're doing the right thing. And then making my block healthier, safer, and more livable tapped into the intrinsic need for self-efficacy or agency. My life actually could make a difference. And I could make a difference where it really matters, the place that I live and I'm raising my children, or my family, or whatever. So, or just myself. So when you tap into these needs of meaning and purpose, community, and agency or self-efficacy, you are meeting a universal need that human beings have. And so we did this program for sustainable living. We did it for disaster resiliency, where we got 68%. We did it around livability. That was in New York City. We did it around livability in inner city Philadelphia, where we got 61% participation. We did around carbon reduction in Portland, where we got 41%. So over time, we found this methodology could be delivered around different pro-social behavioral change needs. And the Cool Block program, to just tie this bow up a little bit, integrates all of those programs because each of them by themselves was able to have an impact at the level of the block or neighborhood. But what we found was by themselves, we did not experience carbon as scalable across a city or disaster resiliency or sustainable living. So that's where we've nailed down the Cool Block. And so our thesis now is that the moment in time we live in, thank God yesterday the Pope did his thing and Obama's doing his thing, the time is coming where climate change is now on the agenda. The UN is doing its thing. So the agenda setters are doing their job. Thank God for them. So, the right term for the Pope. And they need to do their job because my job gets a lot easier when the agenda is set and people are now asking how rather than if. So anyways, that's the story.
So the agenda setters set from the top down. What we're talking about intrinsically is building from the ground up. So I'd love to talk about that kind of dual directionality and how this is the time for it. And it's a very exciting time because as this deploys on the ground level and the agenda is set, that should accelerate this thing.
It should, and it doesn't have to unless we're skillful. So this is where a lot of the work I do on social change and capacity building around the skills of second order change start to come into play. Because the 1.0 world, I call the 1.0 world, people who try to create social, so let me explain social change 1.0 so we have a context. Social change 1.0 is based on legislation, which is command and control, the belief that people are going to have to be forced to change if they're going to change. And what we found is you can't legislate lifestyle change. It's based on financial incentives, the belief that you can incentivize people to change. And we've learned also that people's behavior is elastic, and financial incentives by themselves are not going to create that. And we've got tons of examples of that. They're tools that can be used, but they're supply side tools. But unless the demand is there, it doesn't get very far. California spent $300 million trying to do retrofits, and they got 5,000. And they were trying for, some God knows numbers of millions, because you couldn't get people to change behavior. Financial incentives by themselves don't do it. And then you have social protest, and that's our frustration, our venting process. But then that's always trying to get 1.0 solutions because they don't know any better usually, or they try variations, but it's important. These are all important, but they're not enough. And then the fourth one is awareness raising, like the work that Al Gore has done around climate change. So knowing is different from doing. You know how many people in the health space know what they should do, but they don't do it. So that's the 1.0 universe we're playing in. And so the question then is, how do we smartly use the 1.0 universe? So the agenda setters are awareness raisers. That's great.
Sure.
In California, we now have a carbon system, cap and trade, that really is going to be generating money and putting incentives in the right place. That's great. And then we also have people out there like the 350.org people who are the protesters saying, no, we shouldn't do this, divest this and that. We need that. There's a friend of mine called Dennis Hayes who started Earth Day. He calls it the ecology of action. You need all of the ecosystem niches filled. And then you have, the legislation efforts. And I just heard today that China's created a cap and trade system, bless their souls, and they're aligning with California. So that's going to put pressure. So when you get all of that going, and then you have demand, and what demand does at scale is it creates drivers for the legislation, it creates drivers for the new technologies, it creates drivers for the new market systems that have to be built. So on a block-by-block level, we're actually able to show an individual that if you do this, and you get your neighbors to do this, and they get their neighbors to do this, and your city does this, not only will you have a higher quality of life, but you can actually have leverage in the system to get all the supply-side solutions that are engaged. And now you've got legislators inspired, and you've got all the people investing in green tech inspired who've not made any money on their green tech investments because now there's demand. And now you have people creating new markets inspired. And you get a whole system solution. 1.0, 2.0, supply side, demand side, and that's where you try to get smarter around how to do this kind of change.
Yeah, that's partially where most of my excitement in this conscious capital movement lies, is that as that demand shifts, it will create a tsunami because it creates opportunities. We've seen it with farmers markets, we've seen it with organic food. We've radically transformed food systems already just because people were willing to go to the farmer's market, put a couple extra bucks down and meet the guy that grew their apples or whatever. And that kind of early stage shift into that 2.0 universe, as you would frame it, has actually proven itself out. Now everyone's like talking organic, everyone's really excited about this stuff, but it started with the consumer, it started with the early adopters that said, I want this, I choose this, I'm going to go after this. And so now what we're talking about is doing this on a block by block level and growing it and scaling it and getting it to go. I'd like to get a sense of how vast of an improvement we can see with something like this in, say, carbon footprint. Like, how quickly will we start to see a shift in numbers that will be big enough at what scale to say, holy crap, this is actually changing our climate back, or whatever those success metrics might be?
Okay, great question. Let me just say one thing more about block by block. So the idea of a cool block is the scale I mentioned. The next level up is a cool neighborhood, which is 10 cool blocks. And now you have economies of scale where you can start having an impact on food systems, growing your own food, all kinds of things. The next level of scale is what we call a cool eco district, which is 10 cool neighborhoods. So as you begin to think of a community and you break it into these different units, think of a body, a cell, then you've got an organ, and then you've got, the next level is that. I mean, I'm going to run into my limitation of the fullness of all the, well, I guess the different syllables, because it would be a cell, and then what comes after a cell? It would be
an organ. Yeah.
Organ. I got it right. What comes after an organ?
Just organ systems. So I mean, really, from there's a bunch of organs that make up the body, and there's systems that kind of feed back and forth and communicate. But
so an organ system. So let's call those three, and then the body is the community. So we'll see that analogy holds up. So the idea is that each of them has economies of scale as you work it. So as you think about a cool city, as each of these, you start to see all kinds of possibilities, and now you start seeing supply side, demand side, all kinds of things start to happen. So one of the things that we found is that we're able to get people through the part of this program that reduces carbon, which is originally part of the program I call the low carbon diet. They're getting 25% carbon reduction per household. Now let me give you a big picture on where and why I chose that intervention. 70% of the carbon emitted on the planet comes out of cities. It's a huge, huge leverage point. 70% of that carbon on average comes out of the lifestyle choices we make on how we use energy for our homes and how we transport ourselves and our food. So this is where we have huge leverage, and the demand side is the driver. So the question is, what kind of an impact can we have? Let me add one more part of the cool block. So the cool block is the how of a larger strategy, which we call the Cool City Challenge. And the Cool City Challenge is the cool block at scale. But it's one other thing. In order to get to the place where we can have the impact necessary to really affect climate, the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere, we actually have to go pretty radically into a reduction process. And you can't get there through the supply side. We're learning that. So what you've got with citizens is not only reducing a huge part of the footprint, but becoming political advocates in the system for a change in legislation, a change in technology, and a change in new markets. So they're driving it. So what we've put out on the table, talking about where we started, was a big, hairy, audacious goal, often called BHAGs, which is a carbon neutral city by 2025.
Carbon neutral city.
By 2025, a carbon neutral city, a city that's emitting zero carbon, which no one has done. And we're in conversations with a number of cities that are asking that question. One, I'm not going to mention their name yet because they have not formalized this, but they're moving down the road pretty closely. The first city in the world that is committed to this is Copenhagen. And it's a radical transformation of just about everything. So the Cool City Challenge and its tool, the cool block's end game is a carbon neutral city. And part of what we're getting ready to do, this is actually, I guess you would call this a scoop, maybe. This is the first time I'm sharing this with anybody, and we'll be announcing it on Tuesday, myself and Josie Marin, who's the CEO of Josie Marin Cosmetics, is that company is committing over the next 5 years. I mean, it's a function of their financial wherewithal, but it's a commitment to invest $50 million to create 20 cool cities in California, because California is an early adopter. And,
Awesome.
we want to change the game because we think we can in California. And we want to change the game because California is where the most robust legislation exists, where early adopters live, and where California's reason for being is, and as a Californian, you can take pride, is to be a role model of what's possible, which is why you're doing what you're doing. So then it can diffuse to other places. But we want to go deep, and we want to go big, and we want to go wide in the sense of a whole state. So the plan is to roll out the cool block next year and begin to actually see if we can take it to scale. Scale means minimum of 25% participation rate, up to 75%. And invest enough money, serious money cities don't normally see. They're happy if they get $50,000 grants, but a couple of $1 million over 3 years, 2.5 million to be precise, to scale this up.
Great.
And to have enough resources on the ground to get the whole system to work, to get really high quality on the ground leadership, to work very actively in partnership with the local government, local businesses, local NGOs. So it's a whole system design, because there's so many things that are on the ground right now. They're doing amazing work. In fact, every one of the actions, 112 actions that are in the Cool Block program, represent an advocacy group of some sort. Someone's doing local food. Someone's doing bikes. Someone's doing farmers markets. Someone's doing community gardens. Someone's doing disaster resiliency. So our job is to take what's existing. As I mentioned before, to be smart about this, you get the whole system to work. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. The wheels are there. It's connecting the dots, empowering a whole system solution.
Well, these people are already on the ground, they're well-intentioned, and they're doing it. The fact that you're showing up with cash in hand, with a model that's already proven itself out and is now ready to scale really helps move through the political bureaucracy. And I'm very happy that you're working with a company that's thinking in a for-benefit way. I think more, if you're a company owner, you should look at what your company is doing and how it can pay forward into changing the world and making that part of your cause. That's the new for-benefit economy. That's why the world has gone in different directions, because corporations have been able to dump costs onto the commons, and now we're in this process of correcting this. And just to put a quick example for this is, everyone talks about diet. And then you have a friend that, say, goes paleo, and all of a sudden you haven't seen them in 3 months and they've lost 40 pounds. Now you're interested in the paleo diet, right? And so this is what we're talking about on a city scale, is this first city, maybe the first couple cities do this, they can get to that zero carbon emissions place. Now it's not just a theory, it's proven. And then my belief is that they're going to fall like dominoes. Who wants to live in a world that's falling apart? This is the promise of a future that we can enjoy and collaboratively thrive together. So it's exciting, man. I'm really, really enthusiastic about this. By the way, well.org has committed to following all of this with cameras wherever they go, because I'm just in love with this idea. And, it's something that I think needs global attention, and it also needs local attention. Everyone with a cell phone and Periscope gets involved in this should also be sharing this with their social networks. So there's a lot of ways to kind of kick up the dust on this and accelerate it, and I think we'll see it as we hit the ground running in the first city.
I'm so excited. Pedram, your excitement, enthusiasm certainly is also infectious. One thing I want to say also about this is that for me, there's a key part of my empowerment worldview. We haven't talked about this empowerment framework that undergirds a lot of this, but one of them is a shift from pathology to vision. Simply speaking, pathology is a focus on what's wrong and how to fix it, and vision is a focus on what's possible and how to create it. And when we focus on pathology, our solutions are defined by the problem, and when we focus on vision, our solutions are defined by our imagination. And so we're also putting a new paradigm of social change forward around where people focus their intention and attention. And part of what I see this as being is we're using climate change as the catalyst that it's always been, but not as a focus of what's wrong and how to fix it, but as an opportunity to create the future for humankind, block by block, city by city, country by country. Because if we improve our quality of life, we connect with our neighbors, we create all the new things that you talked about, that people are doing all over the place, they now become scaled. We've built the whole connections around everything. You start to see the world that everyone has wondered if we could have. And the only way that I think one gets that, given how sort of we go slow as a species. It's hard to move a whole species on a journey. And it takes, some smarts on how to sort of find the leverage points and then be successful at it. And this is by no means a guarantee what we're doing. We think we've got a lot of the system conditions right. It's going to take a lot of work and a lot of effort and a lot of good people working hard to make it work. That said, we have a catalytic moment. And that, they often say a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. So the climate crisis is a catalytic moment for being able to drive the changes we want for our world itself.
Yeah, I love it. Dave, I'm obviously a big fan. I want everyone listening to this to be able to track and follow this as it develops, because it's an exciting piece of news for our children's children. How can people find you? How can they follow up with the Cool City Challenge and keep their eyes on this thing?
Thank you. Well, at the moment, I'm just completing that program, finishing the book, getting it edited at the moment. It'll be done and piloted next year in a city. Likely Palo Alto. We're in conversations with them, but we're going to just finalize those conversations. And some other places as well. And then we'll spend about a year working through building our technology platform, getting all the bugs worked out. So I'm thinking by 2017, sometime in 2017, we'll be getting pretty close to being able to start the formal scaling process. Then I'm just going to give you the lay of the land. Then we're going to try to take 2 more cities on, because we were going to go from the prototype phase to the demonstration phase. We can do it in a couple of other cities. And then we want to get the 17 cities towards the end of the 5-year frame, so we have that whole thing in motion. So that's the journey. That's the trajectory. The Cool Block program itself does not demand that you do the Cool City challenge. It just doesn't demand anything. That'll be available to people. So sometime next year, they can go to our website, empowermentinstitute.net. In the interim, there are several things people could do. One is that if they want to start working on their carbon footprint, which is a critical subset, but not the whole program, of the Cool Block, I have a book called Low Carbon Diet, which has been very successful in terms of it taking off and meeting a need. It was a bestseller, and people really get good results out of it. So that's a book people can work with, following the same methodology in the short run if they want to start that process. Any one of these programs are also available on my website. So any number of these sub-programs are available. And then if someone is interested in actually thinking about the very process of architecting second-order change, then there's my book, Social Change 2.0. So those are some of the things. Our institute's another way. That's a more robust version. That might be a later stage for people. But those are some of the different ways that people can plug in.
Love it. Obviously, you're a busy guy. You've been doing a lot of things, and it shows. Could I get like a cheat sheet from you, like the top few things people can do right now to green up their homes, or something that we could kind of post with this article to get people who are enthusiastic started? Is that something you have somewhere?
I don't have a specific thing like that, but I can tell you that there are several actions that probably will be most high leverage around carbon footprint reduction. Greening up one's lifestyle is certainly a bigger question than just carbon, because you have to deal with other issues. But the carbon actions that have the most impact, and I'll start with the one that will be a softball for your world, and that is lowering where you eat on the food chain. Because as you eat more meat, you use more carbon, you generate way more carbon emissions. So you can save 5,000 pounds off of your carbon footprint. And the subtitle of my book is a 30-day program to lose 5,000 pounds. So one action could actually get you that whole result, which is to go from a meat-eating diet to a vegetarian diet. And it doesn't have to be in one fell swoop, but it could be in stages. Another one, simple one, is if your source of energy from your utility is using fossil fuels, you can get the option to be purchasing the energy, what do we call it, renewable energy option, the green option, I guess they call it. And that can also have a significant impact. You just pay a little bit extra a month, and you go from actually generating carbon to not generating carbon. So that's a huge impact on your footprint. I would say a third action that would probably be very helpful for people would be really taking a look at their transportation practices and looking at how they can reduce the amount of vehicle miles they travel through being more efficient, through carpooling. And if you do the cool block, one of the great things is that all of the sharing economy opportunities are available. And I'd also have them check out the sharing economy, because so many ways to actually get your material needs met materially without generating more resources is also powerful. And that's happening all over the world. That's another, I guess you'd say, driver or input into the power of the school block. So you can be doing these things with your neighbors. You can do low carbon diet with your neighbors and all these other programs.
I was going to say, this is very encouraging, and I would implore anyone who's listening to or watching this to say, don't wait till 2017. If you can avoid it, jump in now and do these few things that David's just shared with us. And just start. It feels good. It feels good to be doing it, and you'll realize that it's not as hectic as you think, and life is just as cool, and you can feel good about not contributing to yet another polar bear not having a house. So I think that there's a lot we can do right now, and I encourage people to do that. David, thank you so much. We're out of time. You and I could do this forever, and I just love what you're doing. So we're going to keep following you and keeping our audience abreast of this, obviously, because it's very values aligned with everything we're about. And so just hats off to you, and thanks for doing what you do.
It's my pleasure and honor and great joy to be working with you.
Cheers, thanks. So I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, my goodness, what a guy. And so we're talking about big thinking here, and we're talking about big thinking that's actually happening on a scale that can change the planet. So I really want to know what you think, and I really want to know what you think you can do in your life to bring this in. Just because this thing is booting up and it's so big doesn't mean that we can't start right now in our own lives. So we'll post, if you're listening to this in a podcast, just please go love it up and give us some ratings and give us some comments. And if you want, we're gonna put some of these resources into a blog on well.org associated with this story. So I'll have our team kind of assemble some of the wisdom that he dropped, because there's some really good stuff here, and all his stuff is from data data-driven decisions. No one's making this stuff up. We know that it works, and we know that it'll work for you. So let's do it. Let's do this together. Let's make the world a better place. We have a vision, and we have the enthusiasm, and we have a plan. Awesome. I think that's a great place to be, and I love being here. I love this conversation, and I'll see you in the next show.